His answer to the person who didn't believe in right and wrong and truth and falsehood and good and bad and ugly and beautiful was, God is there. If you don't start there, our vocabulary will just not mean anything, probably. There is a God who is there, and he has a character, he has a personality, and he has a bearing on life. Once that comes into place, once you are a God-reckoning person, then right and wrong and good and bad and so on come into play.
Where can we find meaning and purpose in a world marked by despair and hopelessness? In this episode of Light and Truth, John Piper shares Francis Schaeffer's timeless response, showing how the reality of the God who is there provides the only enduring foundation for hope in a broken world. This seminar was originally delivered at Bethlehem Baptist Church on March 6, 1991.
L'Abri was born by the purchase of a chalet and the intent for people to discover the reality of God there from all over Europe. There's a beautiful statement about the principles that guided them here. It's really remarkable, and it relates to something in my own experience just this week. I think that's why I probably wrote this down as a special lesson for us. They would live by prayer and operate on 4 principles. 1, they would not ask for contributions, but would rather make their needs known to God alone. 2, they would not recruit staff, but would rely on God to send them the right people. 3, plans would be made day to day and not far ahead in order to allow God's sovereignty to guide them. And 4, they would not publicize themselves, but would trust the Lord to send people. Very unmodern approach to starting a ministry. Now, let me relate this to a letter I got this week. I got a letter, and I get one of these every time we have a fund drive, at least one, of somebody who said, I don't like the way we're raising money for this new sanctuary. I think it's very man-centered. I don't think it reflects trust in God. Whatever happened to Hudson Taylor and his approach to raising money? And I have a lot of respect for these concerns. I didn't get mad at this letter. I know this guy. I wrote him right away, and we talk. But now, it was so helpful to me. I mean, I know exactly what I say to those people. I have a little speech all prepared because I've thought about these things for years. I don't want to be man-centered. I don't want to be secular in the way we do things. Basically, what I said was, when I read 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, and the way Paul raised money for the poor saints in Jerusalem, the motives he used, the preparations he used, I find that there is biblical warrant, indeed almost a mandate for making your needs known and for giving incentives to people and for doing advanced preparations so that when you get there, the money is ready. And I mean, it's just very easy from the Bible to defend certain fundraising procedures. However, here's Schaefer doing the Hudson Taylor thing. We're not going to tell people, we're just going to pray, we're not going to recruit. However, when you read on in the rest of the chapter, on page 146, this is probably 20 years later now, the heyday of L'Abri was over. The students had stopped coming, by and large, in the great droves that brought them from all over the world to L'Abri in the 60s. And he felt very burdened with his son Frankie to make a film series called How Then Should We Live, with a book. And it was basically designed to broaden his impact on the local church by showing a history of Western development in culture and how unbelief and secularism and liberalism and the Enlightenment rationalism had brought us to the state of relativism and bankruptcy in morals and spirituality that we now have. Now, to make a film like that, you need money, a lot of it. And so, it says here, it became necessary to appeal for money. And he got a letter. And listen to this. The letter said, "Where did all the commercialism come from? What happened to you? You used to say that numbers weren't important, but that God would bring his own people to hear without advertising. You and Mrs. Schaeffer gave up years of your family life to demonstrate it. You used to deplore religious commercialism, castigate appeals for money, denounce a preacher star system. What happened to you? That's a pretty tough letter to get. Makes you feel like maybe you've abandoned something. And now his answer, I'll just keep reading. Schaeffer's reply was that nothing has happened to us or to Labrie. In establishing the no appeal principle, they had never claimed it was a better or spiritually superior system, but something that God had called them to do in that particular situation. The film series was a different situation with different needs. Further, the film series was not really a part of Labrie, but was made by a separate company, Gospel Films. Each person, Schaeffer wrote, in each Christian work must follow the Lord's own leading for them and stands before God in relation to that alone. The books, tapes, and now the films all represented changes from the small beginnings in the Chalet Meleze. Now that was really encouraging to me to see that he had done both in his life, and he didn't see it as an either or. There was a time and a place where he felt God was leading him to do the no appeal approach, and a time when he was leading him to do the appeal approach. And he believed that both could be right and both could be used. And he answered, I think, gently to this person who wrote him. And I always get skittish when we go into a fund drive at Bethlehem. I don't like it, you know. I wish we didn't have to do them. And yet, the more I think about it, the more I realize that whenever you want to make a major purchase, whether it's a car or a home or a big appliance or something, some thought has to be given to how that money is going to be gathered. You can say, well, I'll take this much out of my account. I mean, if you're not going to go into debt, which I hope you don't for appliances and cars, although most people do today, you have to save it up front. And to save it up front, there has to be some kind of plan. So, that was a lesson that I think was real encouraging. But in those early days, there was the prayer. It was just a saturation with prayer. June 4, 1955, he resigned from the Board of Mission, and they were on their own for the rest of the time. An independent mission, they depended on money to come in, and there are exciting stories, both in this book as well as those, about how God in marvelous ways honored their prayers and brought money at the last minute, just like we like to read in missionary biographies. The goal of Labrie was stated as to reach people for whom traditional concepts had become meaningless. Traditional biblical concepts were meaningless. Or another way they stated it was, we wanted Labrie to be a living witness to the truth that the infinite personal God exists. Os Guinness said the secret of Labrie was that truth mattered and people mattered. One of the ways he made a great impact on the European students who came through Labrie, and the Americans too, was this: they never owned a car in Switzerland. And they did not have most of the things that students assumed Americans had. So they'd come to Labrie expecting to find a typical American with a typical American lifestyle, and they'd find this man with no automobile and pouring virtually all of his time and all of his life into these ragged students who were coming through. And his own life spoke very loudly that he wasn't living for dollars and he wasn't living for himself. Primarily, he was living for others. And that won as many people over probably as his intellect. The process at Labrie was that there were sermons, there were lectures, and there were conversations. Would begin and sometimes would last virtually all afternoon. It noted that three kinds of people came. This is back in the earlier days. First were what he classified as 20th century people, mainly of university age, devastated by the humanistic relativism of modern thinking, who believed that truth and sin were non-existent. Most of those living in Labrie in the 50s and 60s were in that category. And then there were young people from Christian backgrounds who had been turned against biblical faith, either because their churches or youth groups had demanded that they believe without answering their legitimate questions, or because they had been antagonized by seeing little or no Christian love in their church. And a third category was Christian workers who realized they were no longer able to cope with the questions raised by modern youth, and many were on sabbatical leave and went to L'Abri and so on. He considered himself not a philosopher. I noticed on the back of one of these books it said Edith Schaeffer's the wife of philosopher Francis Schaeffer. He never called himself a philosopher. He was an evangelist. If you don't get that straight, then you will probably wind up dishonoring him, because he was not either a professionally trained philosopher, he had no graduate degrees in philosophy, nor was he a profound original thinker. What he was a profoundly caring and insightful question answerer for philosophical types, for people who were mired down in their own intellectual confusion and alienated from the gospel by various cultural and intellectual things. Let me talk a little bit about the content of his talks, especially as he gave them at Wheaton, because this was drawn up in the chapter, and I remember him drawing it. He had a big board up there back, maybe that was before the days of overheads, I don't know, but he had a board instead of an overhead like this. And he was very famous for certain kinds of terminology, like the line of despair. There it is, that's the line of despair. Above the line was the upper story, and below the line was the lower story, or in more traditional terms, grace would be up here, and nature would be down here. You could put God here, the soul, faith, and so on. Down here you would put the body, created things, or reason, rationality. Now, Schaeffer's, I think, his basic paradigm, his way of thinking about what had happened in Western culture is that with the emergence of humanism and the Enlightenment, a line was drawn here, and everything relating to God, grace, the soul, things you can't see, touch, taste, feel with your physical senses, were bumped into the upper story of irrationality and unreality. And what you had left below was what we could see and what we could reason out without the help of revelation and without the existence of God and without anything eternal or supernatural about the human being. We're just a more advanced animal. And basically, he calls this the line of despair, because if you draw a separation between those, you have nothing left but despair. And basically, what he was dealing with was existentialism in his day, which was a philosophy that had attempted to create meaning out of meaninglessness. When you separate God and soul and faith and grace out of nature and the body and created things, and this is all you've got to life, life becomes absurd. So the drama of the absurd and all kinds of art forms that reflect utter absurdity, and certain kinds of theologies. God is dead, kinds of things, and man is dead. Man is basically dead because he's just a higher form of an animal. And so what do? How do you find meaning in life then? If you're just a blip on the screen of evolution, and you're here today and gone tomorrow, and you're a more sophisticated physiological mechanism than an ant, where in the world do you find meaning? And the best we could do in the 50s, 60s was existentialism, which simply meant the sentence that I remember. I never could, I was kind of using the word existentialism when I was in college. I never could quite, what is this thing called existentialism? And the best sentence, now this may take some unpacking, the best sentence that I came up with to define existentialism was: existence precedes essence. That doesn't help at all, does it? Well, it started to help me. What it means is you don't discover anything about your essence from an upper story. You don't look to God. You don't look to faith. You don't look outside yourself to any eternal or supernatural reality to define your essence. You don't do it that way. You don't know what your essence is. Life is absurd. It's totally open-ended. The future is there to be created. And the way you make an essence, the way you make meaning, the way you define what reality is and who you are is just by a choice to be something, to do something. And that's existentialism. You choose to do anything. You might become a dramatist, a painter. You might decide that working in the slums is the way you will make who you are, but it has no meaning except what you make out of it. You make the meaning of your existence. God doesn't determine it. Nothing outside of you determines it. It all just comes out of here because everything is totally relative out there. There's no meaning. There's no truth. There's no good and bad, right and wrong, beautiful and ugly. Everything is just do it. And once you do it, it's you, it's there, and it's all over the place today. I mean, existentialism is not a cool in word anymore, but the reality is still there. Well, that's the kind of student that came to him again and again and again, and he would deal with them. He asked the question, what do you do with a student or a person who comes to you and you want them to realize they're a sinner and that there's a Savior, and that by faith and repentance they can be freed from their sin and have a relationship with God, when the person you're talking to doesn't even believe that there is truth, or there is right, or there is wrong. All your categories that you're using are they're not even in his world. They're not even there. You're like playing cricket, and he only knows the rules to football, and he just looks at you, and you do like, I don't know, how do you do cricket? Baseball and football. And he shakes his head. That doesn't connect. You don't use that in football. His answer was Genesis 1-11. And the God who is there. So his point at Wheaton here, I remember me drawing this line and talking about the upper story and the lower story and the line of despair, and everybody's living in the 20th century below this story trying to make sense, and there's nothing but desperation and absurdity and existentialism, and what needs to happen is the erasing of the line. He did not believe in a blind leap into a void and say, God now. We believe in God because we closed our eyes and just said, I don't know if he's there and I don't think it's possible and there's no reason to do this. I'm just going to leap. He didn't try to do that at all. He tried to give us solid reasons from our own nature and from the nature of history and the nature of nature that there is a God. So he wanted to erase that and pull God in and up into God and unify the two and have no more desperation and despair, but rather an integrated whole to reality and meaning for life. In fact, I think probably one of the biggest impacts Schaefer had on me, and he was working in concert with a number of other really good teachers that I had, was to give me a real hunger to see things whole. Not to have a fragmented view of the world. Too many Christians are fragmented. We have our employment, and we have our children, and we have our health, and we have our money, and we have relationships, and we have future, and we have never been given. We have maybe a little Sunday school faith here that says you're a sinner, repent, believe, be saved, and go to heaven. And that doesn't pull everything together. It doesn't make sense out of reality. And I, like most of you, I'm sure, when you come to your adolescence and you start to grow, you say inside, if faith is going to have integrity, if it's going to be an adult phenomenon in my life, it's got to relate to everything. At least we ought to say that, I think. And he had a vision of the whole universe hanging together. And what I love about my God is that He relates to everything. He pulls everything together. You know, there's nothing I can't talk about. Really. You know, you could say, well, what do you have to say about such and such in some, and even if I didn't know anything about it, I could talk about it because I know who made it. I know what the outcome's going to be in the end. I know some principles that should guide it, coming from God, going towards history. You can say significant about everything if you've got a theology like Schaeffer's. He was a Reformed theologian, which simply means that he had the sovereignty of a creator God overarching all of reality. I thought of the analogy today of these little dot games that you play when you're a kid. You know, at first glance, you look at it and say, what's that? You say, this is number 1, this is number 2, this is number 3. And when you draw the line, it's a dog or a cat or whatever that is. Well, God is like that. Reality without God is kind of a dot here and a dot there and a dot there. And then God comes into your life, and the Bible, with its understanding of the nature of the human soul and our destiny and where we came from and how God is at work right now and what the purposes of things are and what the church is. And suddenly the lines start to get drawn in, and you see this picture that develops, and it just brings a wonderful stability into life. It should give you a sense of security that it relates to something big, and no part of life is meaningless. But Schaeffer globalized, and frankly, I think his globalizing, that is seeing this whole, saved a lot of young people who were fragmented to the core in the 60s. Just life made no sense to them, and they came and they heard this man with remarkable wisdom saying, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That was his answer. I'm getting around to what I said. His answer to the person who didn't believe in right and wrong and truth and falsehood and good and bad and ugly and beautiful was, God is there. If you don't start there, our vocabulary will just not mean anything probably. There is a God who is there, and he has a character, he has a personality, and he has a bearing on life. Once that comes into place, once you are a God-reckoning person, then right and wrong and good and bad and so on come into play. This is very relevant because my son has been in a health class in the 9th grade, and the last few days there's been a person there from Planned Parenthood, and her basic premise is there is no absolute right and wrong. What you decide is right for you and your relationships and your sexual behavior is right for you, and what you decide is right for you. And Benjamin's been hammering away at her, trying to back her into a corner where all relativists ultimately wind up because they don't live out their relativism. But I just realized it's there. It's surviving. It's healthy. It's the way America lives these days. The heyday passes. Thousands of young people are rescued for the kingdom, I believe, through this man's sort of heady ministry. And they go. His ministry turns to the filmmaking of How Then Should We Live and Whatever Happened to the Human Race. The one done with Frankie Schaeffer to show that the collapse of thought was owing to this line of despair and how we need to restore the combination of these things. The other film was about abortion and euthanasia and the whole issue surrounding the dignity of life. And he became increasingly radical toward the end of his life, increasingly radical. When I was doing my little effort with the Operation Rescue here, a year or two ago, I got out the Christian Manifesto, one of the last things he wrote near the end of this 5th volume, and I looked up abortion, and I want to read just a couple of quotes just to show you where he was heading. This brings us to a current issue that is crucial for the future of the church in the United States, the issue of abortion. What is involved is the whole issue of the value of human life. Christians must come to the children's defense, and Christians must come to the defense of human life as such. This defense should be carried on at least 4 fronts. 1, first, we should aggressively support a human life bill or a constitutional amendment protecting the unborn. Second, we must enter the courts seeking to overturn the Supreme Court's abortion decision. Third, legal and political action should be taken against hospitals and abortion clinics that perform abortions. And fourth, the state must be made to feel the presence of the Christian community. And then he says, simultaneously with these steps, some Christians have picketed. I greatly admired Dr. William S. Barker, president of Covenant Theological Seminary in St. Louis, when he supported seminary students who had been arrested for picketing an abortion clinic in St. Louis. And then he goes on to quote them and gives some reasons why. And then, near the end, he says, we must recognize that there is a bottom line if we are to have real freedom of thought and action at the present time, even if, happily, we never reach that bottom line. If we have not faced the possibility of civil disobedience, if needed, our thinking and action at the present time will lack the freedom they should have. And then one last quote. If there is no final place for civil disobedience, then the government has been made autonomous, and as such, it has been put in the place of the living God. I just wonder what Francis Schaeffer would have become and done had he not been cut off in 1984, before the rescue movement came. He was already actively involved in leading rallies of pro-life, and it's just so interesting that as he got older, he got more radical, he got more activistic. He saw that his holistic theology that held things together philosophically was also to be acted out in a holistic way. In other words, not just in personal evangelism, which he never ceased to believe in, but in social action. He belonged to the most conservative Presbyterian group. It split off from the U.S. Presbyterian, then the Orthodox Presbyterian, and then the Bible Presbyterian. Absolutely no social gospel, no social action. And by the end of his life, he had become quite a long-haired radical, as it were, both in his appearance and in his behavior, in saying there are limits to where Christians must intervene, and in his case, ending the note of his life on this whole issue of civil disobedience. So we need to be very careful, I think. His thought ended probably incomplete, and yet the holistic dimensions that he was developing naturally worked themselves out in this way.
This is Light and Truth, God-centered preaching to help you see Christ clearly and treasure Him truly. I'm your host, Dan Kruver. Thank you for listening. On our next episode, John Piper begins a 5-part series titled How to Kill Sin. I hope you'll join us. For more resources, visit desiringgod.org.